Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And today I have a special guest. My guest is Marla. And the reason I met Marla is she is a new patron. And when Marla sent me an email after she became a patron, I found out that she is a fellow Godless granny. And so I told Marla, I would love to meet you and I would love to have you on the show. And this is not usually Marla's cup of tea, but Marla agreed to come and talk to us and tell us a little bit about her story. Hello, Marla.
Well, hello. I'm glad to be here.
Another part of the reason I asked Marla to come is I remember watching a news segment on, I think it was the ABC News. It was about 25 years ago, and it was called Everyone Has a Story. And in that news segment, the reporter would go out to a random town, go to a phone booth that tells you how long ago this was, and pull out the phone book, and he would look in the phone book for a number. He would just take he would open up to a random page and just pick a name at random, call that person, tell them he was coming, go to their house, and talk to them long enough to find out a little bit about them. And sure enough, he would always find something interesting enough about that person to make a national news story out of. And I think that's true of everybody. I think everybody has a story. And since Neil has cornered the deconversion market, I sometimes try to sneak in people who have deconverted and get their story before he does. And I snagged one with Marla.
There are more out there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know there are. And I think all of our stories need to be heard. So Marla, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your early background, your growing up years, and your religion in your childhood?
I had kind of a mixed bag growing up. My mom had grown up in what was called a primitive Methodist church, which is a very small fundamentalist denomination.
I have one question before you go on. In my area, we have the Primitive Baptist Church, and the Primitive Baptist Church is usually a black church or predominantly black church. Is that true of the Primitive
No.
Methodist? No? Okay.
No,
Okay.
no, not even close.
Okay.
No, I can't
So,
imagine. Yeah, I can't remember ever seeing a black person in any of those congregations. But it was old evangelical versus new evangelical, which is quite different.
how are they different?
The old evangelical, so ones before the, say, late 70s, 80s, they actually were people with heart, as I see it.
Okay.
They didn't use their religion to promote what I would say is heartlessness.
Bigotry?
But yes, bigotry, we can use a lot of terms for it. They really cared about people, but they had their own way of expressing their religious views. And I can respect that. I still have many relatives in that community. And in fact, I was just talking to my sister about this a little while ago. It's like, I too respect the people that are religious. I don't agree with them. But as long as they are using it for good, it's a wonderful thing. It helps them to cope with their world. So I grew up with some of that. When I was probably 8 or 9, my parents said, "Hey, we need a church that isn't half an hour away from our farm." So because the kids are getting older, so we moved to a Lutheran church in the little town of 160 people that was down the road. And so then I had Lutheran, but I continued to have this mix of evangelical, Lutheran, some mix of Pentecostal, all the way through high school. During my years as a Bible camp counselor, during all kinds of things. And then in college, I had a chance to shift experiences, but I carried that into college as well. And in college, I was a leader in freshman year, especially sophomore year some, but kind of lost interest some as we went along and questioned views a lot. But Then after I got out of college and got into a job, and didn't do too much. Then I got married. Got married to a strong Baptist woman, and she wanted to be involved in church, and that was part of the kind of conditions that we set out from the beginning. But I got a Lutheran church at least, so I was comfy. She was just happy to get me anywhere.
Was she worried about your immortal soul?
Oh, I'm sure she was. And then we did that. We raised my son in that for a few years, and then moved on, and because she had never been comfortable, and I got tired of it. I was a leader in that church too, and I got tired of all the dirty linen. People just their selfishness, it's like, this isn't what church is supposed to be. And I think part of the problem is it doesn't pay to have an idealistic view of what church should be when you're in the church. And I've heard you say similar things from your experiences too.
That's a very interesting statement. Let's explore that, but let me do a couple things first. I forgot to mention something. This is a lavalier microphone, and Vonric sent this to me. It was on my Amazon wish list, and I really appreciate this, Vonric, because one thing that has driven me crazy about all of the scripted videos I do is I hate that clunky microphone stand. And I have tried all kinds of things to try to reduce the visibility of that microphone stand, and I just could not do it. And I realized what I really needed was a wireless microphone, so I don't need a microphone stand. And so, Vonric, thank you so much for the microphone. Next scripted video, the mic stand will be gone. So thank you for that. And second, I want to say hello to everyone in the chat. It is great to see Maya and Beck and Crypto Maria, Johnny Rapine, Mage Greywolf, and Thor Rasmussen. Thank you all for coming. And we will go ahead and take your questions and comments as we go along. Okay. Back to your story. And I'm sorry, I forgot where we left off. Do you remember?
I believe I was rattling on.
Oh, I know what it was.
Not giving you any opportunity to interrupt.
You were mentioning that that you were a leader and you were getting tired of all of people's dirty linen, and you'd made the statement that you didn't think that people in churches should have expectations of what church should be about. And I found that kind of an odd comment, because I would say I would expect just the opposite. I would expect that when someone comes to a church, they would know, this is what I have to give to the church. This is what I expect to get from the church. And if this is not what I am giving and getting, then I need to find another church that is the correct fit for me. So why do you believe just the opposite, that people should not have expectations of the church?
Churches are fundamentally just another small community. And people join churches, in my experience, in my various roles I was in through the years, they join churches for reasons that have almost nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity. They join because they want to be part of a community. And being part of a community involves a lot of give and take. It involves accepting. It's just like being in a small town. I knew small towns growing up. Okay, if you're going to be part of a small town, everybody knows everything about everybody. And if your focus is more idealistic about, what Christ says this church should be, or whatever it is, then that's not really what that community is about. It is what it says it's about, but it's not really why people are there.
Okay.
And people are, the people that have been there forever, many of them, in my experience, are very uncomfortable with the fact that we're trying to bring new people in, because they don't want new people. They know the church needs it, but they don't want it.
Okay.
And so the idealism gets in the way. And I had too much idealism. If you're going to be a church, it's, I used to have this notion that you shouldn't even have offering plates. You just put a plate back there, and so somebody wants to throw some money in. That's not very realistic. It doesn't work well because that doesn't fit the dynamics of how the community works.
That is exactly the opposite way. Yeah, I never saw that as a believer, and a big part of that was my own personal idealism. For me, I was so gung-ho about the theology and about learning about this God and about this relationship with this God, that's all I saw.
Yeah.
And I just assumed that everybody else was there for the same reasons as I was, and that, we're all about the worship. I never saw that aspect of church. That's interesting.
Well, and it's not universal, of course. It's a matter of tendencies. And there are other people that are idealistic that hang out in there. And I hung out for a long time. I mean, I lasted 20 years through all that before I finally just gave up on that. For 20 years as an adult, after 20 years as a kid. And there's a certain resonance of what you do each week that helps people to feel comfortable in whatever church environment they've gone into. And so if you think of it as a club with some rituals, it comes much closer, or a small town with some shared rituals, it comes much closer to giving you a basis for understanding churches, I think, individual churches. And the politics matter.
Yes, true.
I hated that part of it. I knew the politics mattered. I hated it. And you saw that more. I'd see that more when I'd go to, especially to the conferences at the level above, where you get all the pastors and congregation leaders. And it's like, oh my God, these guys even have any idea what it is we're really here for? Well, apparently I was the one who had the wrong idea of what we were there for. So it took a while for me to really be able to understand that, to be able to accept that.
To accept that people were there for different reasons, or yes. Okay.
Yeah, to realize that most of the people there were not idealistic. We're not there out of some deep, heartfelt belief. That's still my perception. That's after years of leadership, being an elder, working closely with people. I don't think people were really there because of their beliefs, because of it was how they felt. But if you put anyone into a setting, in a church setting, and especially if they've grown up with it, it's harder if you didn't grow up with it. And there's a resonance to the rhythm of the service, to the types of music that are just amazingly, what's the word? They draw you in. Even now, I mean, I could go to a Lutheran church or a Methodist church because I've grown up with some of both, and I can feel that comfort. But I love singing. I love singing the hymns. Some of them, not all of them.
You can still feel the emotional experience.
Yes, it's still there. It just creates a lot more dissonance for me now.
Okay.
But I didn't allow myself to consider all of that during the years, and that's one of the. And I'm getting way ahead of I think where we were going, but.
I was about to ask, what started taking you away from that road? What started to get you to start seeing that the theology didn't work?
The theology, actually in the last church I was in, I wasn't that close to the theology anyway. It was a Reformed congregation, some of that Calvinist stuff that you've spoken about. And I would never bought into all that. This predestination stuff and all that. It's like, give me a break, guys. It is so Eurocentric. It's like, well, if you happen to have ancestors originated in this tiny corner of Europe, then you're one of the predestined. Okay, well, that's nice. It made no sense to me at all. And from a fairness viewpoint, but I stayed in there again because I had family connection with my spouse, and I really wanted to make a difference. And I was able to make a positive difference in people's lives, but it came at a cost. And so, again, when I got tired of dirty laundry again, and I just kind of, after I finished a term as elder, I said, okay, I'm done. I'm out of here. And I'm just not going to go anymore. And leaving, not being part of that community, gave me room to ask questions I wouldn't allow myself to ask before, to accept answers that I wouldn't allow myself to accept before. And that's where the whole path started. And, I had always had all these conflicts that I just wouldn't allow myself to think about. And then, like, okay, let's see where this goes. Let's see what kinds of thoughts this can lead to. Let's see if I can make something that makes sense out of all of this. And that was the beginning of it. Now, I'm a student of a lot of subjects. I love history. I've studied, and I continue to study tons of history going back thousands of years. I love music. I love, I can study religions, although I don't find them that fascinating anymore. There are some good podcasts or some good YouTube videos on there, some channels out there. But if you look at the history, the psychology, the sociological aspects of people, and you can see how it becomes much more likely that we create God than that God ever created us. And atheism as competing probabilities is how I see it. And I live in a world of probabilities. As an engineer, tolerances and probabilities are important parts of my thinking, not these absolutes. And so by allowing myself to consider those competing probabilities, I was able to come up with a very good narrative that made a heck of a lot more sense than anything I had allowed myself to think of before.
Now, did you go to Bible college or seminary?
I went to a Lutheran college, but I studied computer science and math.
Okay.
I had some religion classes, but I'm not a Bible college so much. I went to a real college.
Okay. Were any of the religion classes required?
No, they were choices you could have. But I started college, remember, as a very religious person. So, I found them kind of interesting to learn from that viewpoint. Although freshman year, you don't have much room for electives. But I had some that I fit in. I remember there was one that really got into a lot of mysticism and things like that. And we even went to a monastery for a weekend.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, and focusing on constant prayer. And oh man, I haven't thought about that stuff for years. And it was, what that means. And again, trying to put, I'm way too logical. So I'm trying to make sense of all of this stuff, trying to make it pull together into some kind of cohesive whole. And I never could get all that to make sense. But I found something that was satisfactory for a few months anyway. So I did that. I took some language classes, like I took Hebrew and Greek, just for fun. When
you mentioned the weekend at the monastery, that reminded me one musician that I thoroughly enjoyed as a believer was John Michael Talbot.
Yes.
And I would tell people, John Michael Talbot could sing peace. Listening to him, you just feel peaceful listening to his music.
Yeah, I don't know if he's even around anymore, but yes, I remember.
I don't know either, but I know that he had a monastery and he brought people, people could come there for weekend retreats. And so the first thing I was wondering is if it was John Michael Talbot's monastery.
I doubt it. This was
Okay.
in somewhere in northeast Iowa on the Mississippi River.
Okay.
So, it's probably not his. And I never saw anybody, but what his songs, boy, it's been a long time since I've listened to his music. I used to have some.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it until you mentioned monastery.
But just plain song, what we call chant, is very peaceful in and of itself, and is something again that can resonate with you from an emotional viewpoint, which is what the music is designed to do, is to take advantage of that natural resonance that we have with music. Psychology again. Yeah. Okay. I'm not an expert in anything, but I know a little bit about a lot of things.
That's how I feel too. I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of one. There is one thing I'm a master of, but not too many people are very interested in it, which is workers' compensation law.
Okay. Well, for me, it's engineering. I'm very good at it, but yeah, it's a little different. So, anyway,
so what took you from the point where you were kind of thinking, this isn't so logical, to the point where you're ready to chuck the whole thing out the window?
Again, the key thing was being able to ask questions, allowing myself to ask questions, and just these forbidden things. And trying to think of some examples. It's been so long. And if I'd had all these YouTube videos to focus on back, 20 years ago, it would have been easier in some ways. But that was not something that we had. So I basically had to do it based on my own history lessons and what I could read about psychology, and sociology. And, we didn't talk about sociology much, but I mean, sociology has to do with the dynamics of a society. Based on my one class in sociology back in college, I'm such an expert. But understanding interaction of people and how that interaction drives people to think, to again, accept community, accept all kinds of things for the sake of being a community, and why it's so important to feel a part of a community. So I was able to see all of those effects more objectively. I was able to ask the questions. It's like, the whole creation story. Now, I never bought into the creation story. Well, maybe I did when I was a kid. I don't know. As an adult, I never did. Okay. And when I was in a Lutheran church, it's like, no big deal. Nobody cared about that there either. But in the Reformed church, it was like, I would take some flack from people who knew that I didn't accept that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because in the Reformed church, Adam brought sin into the world. And if there was no literal Adam and Eve, then sin didn't enter the world. If sin didn't enter the world, then Jesus Christ didn't need to come and die for the sin of mankind, and the whole theology collapses. Ken Ham says this a number of times, that if you don't accept Genesis, you can't believe the rest of the Bible. And in some respects, he's right. And obviously, in some respects, he's wrong, because the majority of Christians no longer believe in a literal Adam and Eve, and yet they still believe in the resurrection and the rest of the Christian doctrine. They just don't put together that without Adam and the sin coming into the world through Adam, there's no need for Jesus. But Ken Ham is also right, and that's exactly what happened to me. Once I realized that the flood didn't happen, the whole house of cards just collapsed.
Yeah, well, and the logic is frustrating, because it doesn't tend to be very productive discussion, because it's like we're not going to talk about real stuff, and we're going to misquote everybody and all of that. And so I've gotten tired of even watching videos about people going after the creationist community, because they're so boring. It's the same points over and over and over again. And Ken Ham he's just a con man. But the thing that bothers me about that to a greater extent is that these con men that make so much noise in the new evangelical circles, okay, the televangelists, they are such manipulators. But they get all the attention, but they're not representative of most of the Christians in this country.
Yeah, but the major difference that I see between Ken Ham and the prosperity gospel people is Ken Ham buys his own con. He really believes. You don't think he does?
No, there's no way he does. No way in hell. He is just an incredibly manipulative person. He is the classic con man that will say whatever his audience needs to hear in order to give him what he wants. And so I don't believe for a second that he actually believes what he says. He projects that he does, but that's part of the con.
Okay.
If you look at his history, before he got into that, he was into all kinds of other cons. So he just found one more lucrative than the others.
I'm not aware of what he did before he got. I thought this was what he's always done. What did he do before?
I don't remember the specifics, but if you think about, again, moving away from the majority of Christians who are really pretty reasonable people, they just have a quiet belief. But if we look at the televangelists and their communities, I have some notes. I sent you some notes last week or a couple weeks ago on my thoughts on all this, and
I have them on my screen. I've got a few of them highlighted.
And I haven't been able to look at mine because I've been busy talking. But I added a couple notes today that I'd been thinking about while we were flying back from our trip. And one of them is this notion of sheep and wolves, or where wolves are rather than in sheep's clothing, they're in shepherd's clothing. So the shepherds that we have accepted are there to fleece the many sheep that are available to them. And unfortunately, for every nice, well-meaning person, there are plenty of predators out there ready to take advantage of them. And religion gives them a strong means to do that manipulation, to take advantage of them. And that is, and it does work based on emotional manipulation in most cases, in my experience. And I remember having discussions with pastors about that in our churches when I was a leader, especially in the second one, the Reformed church, the second one in my adult life, I should say. And it's like, well, we should be able to do this without taking advantage of people's emotions. It's like, if somebody's down, we shouldn't just go and try to take advantage of that. And he disagreed with me. It's like, well, this is when we need to be there. And it's like, well, they need us in this situation, but it isn't just that. What I saw is that really what we did is we would appeal to emotion, and when I did a lot of leading the hymn singing from the front of a congregation, and I would try to do that same thing. And we would pick hymns that would, at different parts of the service are made to take you through an emotional cycle as you go through the service. The liturgy in a Catholic or Lutheran congregation does the same thing. It takes you through that whole cycle of emotion. And it is, and I found it to be kind of funny. I mean, every church has its rhythm, and that church in that rhythm involves how we can reach out and grab people's emotions to serve our purpose at any given time. I remember as a child, my grandma, she was a church organist at this one church for like 50 years. It's a long, long time. And we would go there with her. And during you go from the offering, or is it the offering afterward? No, I think the offering is just before. And then you had the long prayer. What I always thought of as the long prayer. I'm sure they had a better name for it. But as a 10-year-old kid, it is a long prayer. It just goes on and on. And my grandma would be playing the organ during all that, and amplifying the notes that the pastor was saying, it's quiet tones up to bigger tones. And then and I could still play that in my head, what they were doing throughout that prayer. And that was just one piece of the service, but it was near the end. And so it was designed to send you out with a certain high feeling and you're feeling good about it all. And then you have a closing hymn right after that and a benediction, and you're going out and you're feeling triumphant no matter what. And again, that plays to the emotions, and the churches need that emotion. They depend on that emotion. That is how they get the growth. And if you look at the yearly cycle, some churches are tied to the yearly cycle more than others. But I mean, especially the Lenten season, right? It is pure appeal to emotion, and it take you, through the whole thing. Lenten, so midweek Lent services. I don't know if you had those in your church, but midweek Lent services would be really deep into the emotion of Lent. At night, it is so much more emotional that when things are going dark, you're telling the darker stories as weeks go on. And then, so you have these services at night when it's dark, and then on Easter, it's a daytime service, or maybe even a dawn service. So first thing in the morning, and it's
sunrise service. We called it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we called it sunrise service. In fact,
service, that's what it was. I couldn't think of a word.
When I lived in Texas, the Baptist churches that I went to, Easter Sunday service would be outside if the weather was permitting. Now, when I lived in Fort Wayne, there was usually still snow on the ground at Easter time.
Really?
And yeah, or at least it was too cold to have an outside service.
That probably is.
Yeah. But in Texas, it was not. And so that was kind of fun, having an outdoor service.
Okay. Yeah, watch the sun come up. Yeah, that would be, that'd be a wonderful way. And again, it appeals to the emotions. And so if you have this idea, this misplaced idealism again, that rational thought should have a place in all of this, then you're going to have a conflict with that. And there's only so long you can deal with that and set it aside. But if we look at it again as that kind of manipulation, and if we say that emotion can be used to manipulate and is a key part of that, then it helps to explain and to understand how the manipulators, the wolves, can swoop in and so easily take advantage of the flock. Who will follow them anywhere they'll lead, as long as they give them their highs when they want their highs.
That is a really interesting point, and that explains why there is so much clergy abuse. Why it is so easy for the clergy to get away with being abusive, because as long as they are leading the flock where they want it to go, they can usually get away with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you hear about, just down the road from Fort Wayne here over in Warsaw, there was one a few months ago. Got a lot of press. It's like,
Now, I did not
he
hear that
abused
one.
this woman, and then the whole congregation defended him, and
Mm,
upset with her.
yeah,
How
that
dare you
is.
expose him? Yeah. So
That was, the biggest one that was like that was John MacArthur's church. And being from a Reformed background, I'm sure you know all about John MacArthur, because he's
I
one
don't
of the.
actually.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. He wrote a whole series of books. He wrote a Bible study series that's often used as Sunday school material, and he has a mega church in Los Angeles. He was really in the news a couple years ago because he defied the pandemic regulations in Los
Oh,
Angeles.
okay. I remember seeing
And
somebody. Yes.
yeah, people that did, but he is one that went to court and won. Um, and one of the things that I've always wanted to know is how many people got COVID because of John MacArthur. But unfortunately, because he lives in Los Angeles, where there's a huge population, even though his congregation is a mega congregation, it's still not big enough to have a sizable impact on the COVID numbers for the entire city. Thor Rasmussen, thank you so much for becoming a new member. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Cool. So yeah, but I mean, and I just read the other day about a Southern Baptist convention. They've got problems maybe as big as the Roman Catholic Church has, but they don't want to. They're doing everything they can to hide it, just like the Catholic Church does. And again, once you surrender to the idea of authority, then you're going to be open to these predators, and it's inevitable, and you can't do much to prevent it. And that's, to me, that is the thing. That is one of the main things that takes me from just being atheist, as it were, to being anti-theist, is seeing just how that manipulation can work in so many cases, and having seen it in milder cases myself with some pastors, and knowing how a pastor who really wanted to push the limits could get away with it, and they do.
The abuse story that came out, and if you've ever heard of Julie Royce of Royce Report, she's the one that really broke this story and did a tremendous job of digging out the whole story, because the story is a 20-year-long story. And what happened was about 22 years ago, there's a woman in the church. Her husband was either an elder or was in some form of leadership. And she wanted to leave him because he was abusing her children.
Right.
And so first they went through church counseling. And here's the thing that I find absolutely flabbergasting is in church counseling, he admitted to attempting to murder one of his children. He choked this child and threw this child into a closet. And he admitted that he was trying to kill the child. And so this woman left him, and the church was very against her because she's wronging this church leader. And I'm going, he admitted to trying to kill the child. How much more does he need to do? Then after she left the church, there was so much animosity against her. She ended up fleeing the state and moved to Texas. And after she got the children out of state and got to Texas, one of the children opened up that he was also being sexually abusive against the children. And so then she brought charges against him for sexual abuse, and he was convicted and he went to jail. But she kept quiet about what the church did to her until the children were all grown, because she knew that if she ever said anything, that the church would retaliate against her, and she didn't want them to know her. So she waited 20 years until all the children were grown and then told her full story. And what I find absolutely flabbergasting is I watched a channel recently where someone was saying, how dare she come and tell this story now? Just because he was convicted of sexually abusing a child doesn't mean he actually did it.
Oh my.
And I'm going, what do you need? The child, the man admitted to attempted murder. The man was convicted of sexual molestation, and you still defend him. Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense to me. Yeah,
Well,
if you're interested in that story, check out Julie Royce on Royce Reports. She has the full story in a series of articles.
There are so many stories like that, but I try to be fair about it too. I know so many very well-meaning pastors as well. And I've known many through my life, and I know that most of them are wonderful people who really care about their people and are there to really care about their flock. And I have cousins and uncles, and my stepfather was a Methodist minister for many, many years, and he's a wonderful man. My mom was a lay minister and had churches for a while. And so I know there are most of them that really care about their flock. But what I worry about is just the opportunity that exists in many situations for all these bad things to happen. And so I don't know how you find the right balance in that. And of course, it's not up to us to help them find that balance. But
true, that's true. I think the answer is there has to be oversight and accountability, and it has to be real. They have the illusion of oversight and accountability. The Catholic Church has their hierarchy, the Southern Baptist Church has their convention, and most of the other denominations have their denominational hierarchies. But the problem is that the people at the top don't discipline pastors and leaders who are involved in wrongdoing. Instead, they cover it up.
Well, and again, we're on the outside. I know that some denominations handle that much more and much better than others. I've seen that for what I've learned from others and from my work. So I hate to cast it too broadly, but the potential that can exist is the most worrisome part. So that is something that we can be aware of. But as an outsider, I don't feel like I can ever influence that. But it's something I have to take into consideration as I consider just how anti-theist I'm going to be. As I mentioned earlier, I have total respect for the many family members I have and friends who practice their religion quietly.
Let's go to that aspect of your life. First of all, let's start with what was deconversion a slow process for you, or was there a point where you can point to that said, this was the point where I said, I really don't believe this stuff anymore?
Well, slow is a matter of how you count the years.
Okay.
I can't point to any particular date or a moment in time when it's like, oh, this is crap. It was probably over about a 4-year period where I gradually came to that realization, and it was after I had let myself get into that situation where I could consider it. So somewhere between, say, 2004 and 2008, I had pretty well solidified it. And it was again made easier by the fact that I got divorced from my first ex, so I didn't have to worry about accountability that direction on it, and didn't have to explain things anymore.
Mhm.
And so that allowed even more self-statements. I remember one particular conversation with my now second ex, before we got married, and they were mildly into church, not heavily, and it's like, well, it's okay if you don't go to church as long as you explain to me why you don't believe. So I gave her this long diatribe.
Mhm.
It went on for probably 2 hours, where I explained from angles of history, various angles of history and psychology and sociology and every other ology you can think of, why I felt that way,
Mhm.
why I had come to that conclusion.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I know by, late 2008, I had all that figured out, just
Mhm.
kind of in my own mind. Now I've been able to come up with a lot more groundwork for all of that, a lot, in the years since. And some of the challenges to get me to think about it came from people asking me questions.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
uh,
Were they unbelievers or just believers that were wanting conversation?
well, actually, strangely, unbeliever depends on how you talk about unbelievers.
Okay.
The people I dealt with more over about a 10-year period after that were people that weren't necessarily churchgoers, but they believed in all this other stuff: alternative medicine, astrology, auras,
Spiritualists?
yeah, all this spiritual stuff that, and they, and it's like, well, how can you not believe this? And what do you think of this? And I learned pretty quickly the hard way. It's like, do you really want to know what I think? Do you really, really want to know what I think? Um, and so but I would go, something new would come up, and it's like, I don't have any idea what it is you're talking about. It sounds totally ridiculous to me. So, but I'll go do some research, and I learned to be careful not to show where my research came from. Um,
Mhm.
but I remember one in particular, iridology. I don't know if you ever heard of iridology. It's like,
No, I haven't.
you can tell everything about a person's health by looking at the iris of their eye,
Mm.
the patterns
Okay.
in that iris. And I was like, oh, this sounds just wonderful. How can this possibly be? but
Yeah,
but
if it was true, that's what doctors would be studying instead of the
well,
years
yeah.
that they take studying everything else.
Well, and all these supplements and cures and all these things, that don't have to be proven. Um, and I need to get to the foundations of that in a minute, because that's important for understanding some of this too. But if they're going to ask me what I think about it, if they're going to ask me to be part of it with them, then I need to make sure that I do my own research. And fortunately, the
Mhm.
web was around by then. I could do all kinds of research on what was going on, and what evidence there is. And one of the arguments I would make is like, if it's so great, why don't they go out and do a nice scientific study and break it to the rest of us, so all of us can benefit from it. And that was usually met with the argument that, well, that would never work because of the giant conspiracy against these things. The
Oh,
medical
yeah. Oh,
community
yeah.
and
That's
the
always what it
pharmaceutical
is.
industry are just giant conspiracies that make it impossible for them to get published, to make anything through. And so it's
Mhm.
so the world is stacked against us, conspiracies. Um, but I remember, I wanted to get back to this because this goes back to the religious angle of it. Multi-level marketing firm that my ex was involved with before we got together, and continued to be. And so we went to this gathering of salespeople in Chicago. We were going to be in Chicago anyway for It's just before we went to Hawaii. And so we went to this thing, and the whole service sounded just like a revival. Had the rhythm of a revival. And I had done revival services as a kid, and I'd helped to lead some as a teenager. And I was like, oh my God, this is a revival service, including the equivalent of an altar call at the end. And, you know, come and get our goodies. And, you know, it's great that you believe, and almost like a prayer or benediction. And I was like, everything except the hymns. It's like, oh my God, it's the same thing. It's just another religion with the same kind of emotional manipulation.
Yeah, that's what Christians often accuse us of. And when I say us, I mean atheists. Yeah, they say, well, you just you don't really give up God, you just change to a different God.
Yeah.
And I think the people that you're talking about now might be a part of the reason why they say that, because a lot of people who deconvert do not go to atheism, they go to spiritualism. And so they do just change religions, but they see that as being everybody, not just, you know, that atheists haven't given up religion altogether.
Yeah, it's all part of the same whole spiritualism and religion, and it's all appealing to the same thought centers in our brains, to it, you know, wherever all that stuff lands. And yeah.
So when you left your faith, was there any difficulty with family members or friends?
Not really, but mainly because I didn't talk about it very much. I mean,
okay.
The friends that I mentioned about, you know, being into astrology and all these other alternative medicine kinds of things, that was complicated. Because I wasn't into those particular what you and I might call religions. But and it didn't cause my second divorce, but it probably didn't help. It was actually probably a major contributor.
Okay.
Because we had agreed to disagree from the beginning, and it's turned out to be a one-ended bargain. And so, but you know, in general, I don't talk to my family about it much, and it's it's strange. You know, I've come out about so many things to family through the years, and like my Facebook postings and stuff. But the fact that I'm atheist is something I don't post on there. There are too many people that I think would have a harder time accepting that than any of the other things that I've come out about. And that's crazy. I mean, especially since, you know, I'm a lesbian and all this other stuff. But it's like, okay, this is just one bridge too far. And I don't understand why that is, but I don't need to push it. It isn't important to me to push it on them, and I don't want to. I mean, most of the people in my life who are religious are quietly religious, and they have good intent, and I don't see any reason to disturb that.
Okay. Now, were you accepted within the Reformed Church as a lesbian?
I don't believe I was known as a lesbian at that time.
Okay.
So that's more complicated.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, one of the things that you said in your notes I found very interesting, and that was you said belief is a very human activity and subject to human frailties. It's almost never based on philosophy or reason. And you specified that recently Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic made a video that you found particularly compelling on this called Arguments for God Are Not Important. You want to tell us a little bit about what you meant by those things?
Well, this is something that had been nagging at me for a few years. And it's like I kept seeing videos but on YouTube that argued primarily, you know, from rational viewpoints, like, well, you know, we can prove there's no God, or maybe we can't prove there's no God, but we can make it seem incredibly unlikely and all that. And it's like, it's pointless, because this goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. This is not why people are in these communities. People are in these communities for totally different reasons than because of their beliefs. They'll say it's because of beliefs, but it isn't, and it never has been. And so if you want to appeal to someone, in the first place, you have to wait till they're willing to consider questions, to consider answers that might lead them astray. And if they're not there, you're never going to reach them. But there are points in time when people, just as churches take advantage of when people are open to emotional manipulation, there are times when we can look for when people are open to, and I hate to say it, but rational manipulation.
And do you think atheists take advantage of that?
I don't think there's a lot of atheists.
Right, that's true.
There are a lot of people who do things in a lot of very different ways. There are a lot of atheists that are fairly, shall we say, religious about their atheism. And where it's very important to them emotionally. And it isn't just something that they quietly accept for themselves. And I think it's important to have some of those people around, but we need to recognize the weakness of that position and how that can antagonize the very people that you're trying to hope to come to the side of reason. Now, we have to look at it as, do we really want to evangelize? And if we evangelize, then are we being religious inherently?
I don't think so.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what the answer is there. Yeah.
Because to me, religion involves ritual, and it involves belief in something supernatural. I mean, if it doesn't involve something supernatural, it isn't a religion. You can do religiously, but that's a different form of the word. It's, if you go to the movies religiously, going to the movies doesn't become your religion. It's just something that you do regularly. And because you do it regularly, it almost seems like a ritual. And that's why we use the word religiously. But that isn't intending to denote a religion. And I think that's the case with atheism. Is you're right. There's some of us, and I include myself in that group, atheists. And I am so because when I deconverted, my life didn't change that much. And religion was the driving force of my life. And so now I wouldn't say that atheism is the driving force of my life the same way that religion was, but I do feel a similar drive to share what I believe about atheism in the same way that I did about religion, only because now that I am an atheist, I look back at how much damage that did to me. And I don't want anyone else to go through that. And if I can save someone else the 40 years of pain that I went through as a believer, hey, I'm all for telling them my story for that reason.
Well, and if they're open to it, and if they
exactly
when they want to hear it, it's a hard balance to strike.
Actually, I don't find it difficult at all, because I'm on YouTube, where anybody who doesn't want to hear it can just turn me off. And anyone who doesn't want to talk about it isn't going to be a guest on my show. And so who hears my what I have to say is entirely voluntary. I don't go out in the streets and do this.
Yeah, true. And but they're, again, looking at it from an evangelistic viewpoint. Okay, sharing the good news, as it were. And we consider this to be good news, that there's another way to look at the world. There's a better way to look at the world. There's a better way to live your life that isn't hindered, as we see it, by your religion. There's a better way to think of the world. But is it really for everybody? Religion is there for a reason. And people have an innate need to make sense of the world. And when we try to coordinate that among people, then it becomes kind of a common thread of thought. If we add some manipulative leaders, it can become a full-blown religion. Or if we can just add some shepherds that really care about the flock, it can become a gentler religion. And
ultimately, though, don't you think that all religions are made up by people?
it depends on what you mean by that. And
what I mean is that there aren't any actual gods out there. There aren't any actual spirits out there. So all of the theology about who God is or what a spirit is or whatever are all things that people come up with, and attributes that we attribute to these supernatural beings, because the supernatural beings aren't real.
There certainly is a good chunk of that. But one of the things that I'm always conscious of, even when I was religious, is the person next to me or to the other side of me in the pew doesn't even have the same view of gods, doesn't have the same view of what their religion means than I do, even on many points. And so to say that religion is actually consciously built up at that level, where people are just trying to make sense of this world around them, and trying of the stuff that happens that they can't manage, of trying to deal with the internal emotions they feel about events, and all that in many cases fashioned from birth within a certain religious environment, then there are certain patterns that they're going to go through, and those will result in religion of some kind. But that's different from saying it's an organized religion. So that native religion that each of us goes through.
I don't think each of us does go through that. I've met enough cradle atheists who have said that they've never had any religious feelings or feelings about God. So I don't think all of us do go through it. I think the only ones of us that do go through that are people who were conditioned to do that at an early age.
Well, to say that a God is associated with it is something else. But to say that something irrational is happening, and to just naturally accept that irrational thing has no meaning. As a child, I don't believe that we naturally go to, most of us anyway, go to oh God, there must be some rational explanation for that I just don't understand. As a child, we try to make some kind of irrational sense out of it. And from that, you get, in the earliest religions, animism, where it's like, okay, we'll try to make some sense out of that. And then as things get more organized, you try to get things, or you end up getting people collectively trying to make some sense. And a lot of that gets driven more by politics than it does by any actual belief system. So.
Okay, I love this idea, Johnny. I should go outside, put on a sandwich board, and hold up a megaphone and yell, "Have you ever told a lie? Good for you."
Oh, God. Yeah, let's all go out like Ray Comfort. Oh,
right.
God. Yeah.
No, except when people agree that they've told a lie or whatever, just say "good for you," and that's the end of the conversation.
All right.
Danny D says, I have friends that don't go to church but claim to be religious. The only thing they know is that they and their loved ones are going to heaven. Yeah. And that's generally the biggest draw that religion has, is the claim that they will offer you um, eternal life,
Well,
immortality.
and the flip side of that, depending on what church you were brought up in, is the absence of hell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the fear of hell is a very real thing.
I do not feel that.
Depends on what you were brought up with, doesn't it?
Right, right. And I think that's part of it. Is my parents were Catholic when I was very young, but my mother always really rejected the idea of hell. And so even though we were going to a Catholic church, she said, I can't believe that a loving God would ever send anyone to hell. And so I never really had a strong hell belief. Now, when I was a teenager and I became a Protestant, yeah, I bought the whole hell idea, but I never had the emotional fear of it that I hear a lot of people express. And so when I did deconvert, I never had this nagging fear that I might go to hell. And when people tell me, "Oh, you're going to hell," I chuckle. I think that's funny. Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. Tell me another one.
Well, I certainly knew thoughts of hell growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't learn it so much in the Lutheran tradition, but in the other traditions to which I was exposed in this weird amalgam of thoughts. But that was, and there are a lot of people that are brought up with that, and especially people brought up in a deeply fundamentalist view. Fear of hell is perhaps a stronger incentive to stay in the church than desire for heaven.
This is an interesting comment. Peyton Dooley says, I've got pictures of me going out with Ray Comfort. I went to his Ambassadors Academy.
Ooh, was he a nice date? I can't imagine you'd ever get a word in. What?
Ultimate Reductionist says, my super friend, trans vegan atheist Trucker Sue, told me about this great channel. Oh, I know who Trucker Sue is. Well, thank you, Trucker Sue, for recommending me, and thank you to Ultimate Reductionist for coming. He says, I'm a hetero male vegan atheist PhD mathematician. Okay, good to know. I occasionally have to do math for some of my shows, and I always have to go find someone to either do the math for me or check my math, because math is not my forte. The most recent one that I had to do was I needed to find out how much. Oh, I asked someone how much heat would be generated if God had transformed Jesus' body from physical mass to energy, using the E equals mc squared formula. How much heat is generated by transforming a body into energy? And yeah, the answer was like 50 megaton bombs. And
yeah. I have a bachelor's in math, but I can do that. I can handle that calculation. So the PhD in math beats me.
So. Yeah, that was the reason I asked the question, is because one of the questions that I ask to Christians is, if Jesus resurrected bodily at the resurrection, where is his body now? Because a physical body has to exist in physical space. Is heaven a physical place? And they always say no. Well, is Jesus' physical body there? Well, no, God transformed it into a spiritual body. And now,
just
obviously,
like Elijah, just like Elijah.
Right. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, if anyone ever gave me the answer, well, he just transformed it into energy, what would I respond? And so that's where I came up with the question. Although no one's ever actually said he transformed it into energy. It's always he transformed it into a spirit.
I think the Starship Enterprise turned it into energy and transported him to some other planet, and that took.
There we go. There we go. Jesus didn't rise up into the clouds. It was a transporter that broke up all of the molecules and sent them into outer space.
And that's perfectly believable with no physical problems whatsoever. So, yeah, we should have no problem with that.
Although one answer I got from a person who turned out to be a universalist was really interesting because he said, well, it became the dust of the earth. I said, well, if Jesus' body became the dust of the earth, then he's dead. I mean, that's what happens to everybody's body when they
We
die.
all decompose, yeah.
Right. And he had to think about that one because that means there was no bodily resurrection if Jesus' body decomposed and all it was left was his spirit.
Well, and there are a lot of beliefs, differing beliefs, official and unofficial, as to how corporeal things really are and the resurrection of each of us and with Jesus and all of that, and what heaven, and it's all complicated stories. And if you look at the history of the church, of course, all that was part of a debate early on. Nearly every one of those possibilities was considered by one of the church variants that existed in the first centuries, until we get to sort of what we have now. Sort of, although what we have now is nothing like what we had in the fourth century.
Mage has an interesting comment. Jesus is God, trapped in an endless time loop, fated to be his own father.
Okay.
In one respect, that makes absolute sense. Yeah. Because if Jesus is supposed to be timeless and he lives yesterday, today, and forever simultaneously, then yes, he would in fact be trapped in an endless time loop. And he would be forever nailed to the cross and forever rising from the dead and forever creating the world. And oh gosh, that's a concept that I'd never considered before, and it kind of blows my mind.
Years ago, when I was a Bible camp counselor, I did that for 4 summers, and I remember some of the kids asked me questions like that. And it's like, what is eternity? What is it? And all this, and it's like, and the explanations you'd try, and you'd wing it because there aren't any good answers. But it's like, I'm sure I can come up with something that makes sense to these kids. But I don't think any of us can actually understand what all that means. And I think officially none of the churches do either, but the pastors will act like they do. It's like, you can't know, but it's a secret we have.
Yeah, and that's the basis of the Gnostic religion. One of the early, we now would call heresies. And some of Paul's writing was specifically to combat the Gnostics.
Well, I don't think you can actually say that. Paul was before the Gnostics. He came before them, but they had different gospels. You need to watch Bart Ehrman. He gets into a lot of that.
Okay. Brooklyn Lou, the skeptic, says the great thing about religion for many people is that they do not need it to make sense.
And I think that's quite true. In fact, it's better if it doesn't make sense. Again, you don't ask for questions. You don't look for answers. You don't read that whole Bible, or if you do, you interpret it through these God eyes.
God glasses, yes, yes.
God glasses, yeah. I think that's a term I've heard out there. It's like, if all this weird stuff happened in the Old Testament or even in the New Testament, it's like, hey, that's fine. Just don't think about it.
So. What do you think caused you the most cognitive dissonance as you were starting to question your faith?
Give me a second. Cognitive dissonance. It certainly wasn't doctrine.
Okay.
Doctrine, I understood doctrine as just this stuff, basically these kind of committees put together, and it's like, okay, they're going to be inherently self-contradictory. That's life, because they just have to make everybody happy, try to come up with a way to exclude people. But I think there are, and it's not so much when I was getting to a point where I was ready to give it up. By then it was easy. I didn't have to worry about dissonance. I just say, okay, we'll have it. But through the years, the creation stories, the disconnects in the stories of Jesus' birth and Jesus' death among the Gospels.
Now, did you find those on your own as a believer, or did someone point those out to you, or did you hear someone talking about them, or
I was
how did
on my own for a long time figuring all this out.
you? Okay.
So no, and you didn't have YouTube then. I didn't read any of the books. So no, but I had read the Bible a couple of times cover to cover, including the Apocrypha. And I have a fairly good memory. And I had looked at the various Gospels side by side, and it's like, but I believed what we were taught when I was a kid, that, okay, these were actually done by witnesses. So for some reason, we just screwed it up. And now it's like, what? Those guys weren't even around. We don't even know who wrote those things. Okay, but I didn't know that then.
Yeah, I didn't either.
And so,
I didn't either.
but I would look at these disconnects, and I would just say, okay, I don't understand it, but it's not up to me to understand. I just have to accept.
Yeah, when I read them, I didn't even see them. And that is part of the God glasses, that I was so convinced that everything that this book said was absolutely true, that when I would read the gospel account of the story in one book and then another day read it in another book, I didn't even see them. Now, the difference between the women that are named in one gospel and another, those I did see, but I never put any credence to it. That, okay, so one person mentioned that these people were there and another person mentioned that these people were there. It doesn't mean that either one of them is wrong. It's just, if I said I went to the store with John and Jane, that doesn't mean Paul and Bill weren't there. It just, I just didn't happen to mention Paul and Bill this time. And somebody else who saw us there said, oh yeah, I saw all five of you,
Yeah, and some of those are it's like, okay, I can sort of come up with an explanation, but I don't want to. I don't want to think too deeply about it. I want to let it go. I want to believe. And so if I think about that stuff too deeply, then it's going to make it harder to believe. So I just wouldn't. I look back now, it's like.
Now, I had a completely different approach, because whenever something did get to the point where it really was a cognitive dissonance, I would run to the pastor and say, the Bible says this and the Bible says this, and they can't possibly both be true. How does that work? And I always sincerely believed that the pastor would always have an answer, because that's what they went to seminary for, and that's what they learned. And to almost all of my questions, they would give me some kind of a plausible answer. And when they couldn't give me a plausible answer, they would give me, well, we don't really understand this, but somehow it works. And we know that God's in control. We know that God's good. And one day we'll go to heaven. We'll get to ask him about this and he'll explain it to us. And I was able to accept that. But the one question that I never got a satisfactory answer to was, how did we get the canon? And some pastors, now these are not the words they use, but essentially the feeling I got was, go away, kid, you're bothering me. Most of them didn't even want to answer that question. Yeah. Or they would tell me, well, go to the church library and find a book on church history. You'll find it in there. They did not want to answer that question.
Well, yeah, and realizing, if they really answer, which they learn in seminary, if they go to a decent seminary, if they answer what they really know, then it's not going to be very beneficial to them keeping their congregation together. But that's, and again, the story and knowing how fragmentary all of those old sources are, it's been something I've just learned the last couple of years, and it's like, oh my God, it was worse than I thought. But I think about rationalizing again, dissonance. It's like, what amazes me now is looking at all those stories that I learned as a kid from the Old Testament. And most of the stories you learn as a kid from the Old Testament include a certain amount of genocide. And and include all these horrible things going on, but your good guys won. David he was a great guy, despite all this really awful stuff he did. Or the genocide that got in the flood, supposedly, and the many genocides. I read them. How in the world did I not see them? How did I not see them as being evil? And I guess the assumption was that I assumed that we had a moral God.
Yes, exactly.
And I couldn't see the world in any other way than that we had a God worth worshiping. And that is something I've really only come to see the last few years, as I've seen some of these videos that on YouTube that people do. And it's like, oh my God, where was I?
Yeah. One of the things that impressed me as a believer was the verse that said, and God shut the door to the ark with regards to Noah's flood. And I was so impressed as a believer that it wasn't Noah that shut the door. Noah did not judge the world. Noah did not keep anyone out of the ark. God did that himself, that this was his judgment.
Okay.
And now as an unbeliever, I see that in a completely different light. And I'm going, all right, why? And I particularly focus on children because you can make a weak case for, okay, all of the adults were guilty of something, but not the children.
No.
And if you seriously have all the power of the universe in your hands, that you can just Thanos them out of existence, why did you drown the children? And the animals, what did the animals do? Why did they have to suffer? And, it just blows my mind that I was so blind that I could not see that as a believer.
Well, it's not like that's the only genocide in there. I mean, the book of Judges is full of them. One after another, and the rest of the Pentateuch, and going into books of Samuel and Kings. It's like, oh my God, how did I not see it? And I still don't get that. But the mindset is amazing.
An ultimate reductionist, you may absolutely ask a non-religion question. Ask away, and if we have an answer, we'll give it to you. And if we don't have an answer, we'll let you know. And Peyton Dooley says, yep, the Reformed answer, they were born sinners. Yeah.
We all were.
And that was one of the greatest areas of cognitive dissonance for me, is when I figured out that, this is a funny story too. When I figured out that the age of accountability doesn't work, because that's what we were always led to believe, that children reach an age of accountability, and before that, they're kind of innocent. And in the Reformed Church, they don't have an age of accountability. When you are born, you're already a sinner. And so either you were either elect and chosen to salvation, or you were not elect and you were, and they about that. But they will never finish that thought. But when I finally did finish that thought, that was the thing that really broke my theology, was thinking about the fact that means all of the unelect were chosen to go to hell. Oh, thank you very much for the super chat, Dan D. He says, thanks, Godless, Granny, and Marla. Yes, thank you very much for coming, and I'm glad that you're enjoying the conversation. So anyway, sorry, I lost my train of thought. We were talking about the elect children, and somehow God will elect all of the babies because they're innocent. And yet that makes absolutely no sense with the doctrine.
Well, yeah, all of that. The Reformed position is even more inane than some of the others. But I remember doing catechism in the Lutheran Church when I was, and we did have a certain age where we didn't have to, but we all did go through catechism. And one of the fundamentals is, yes, we are all born as sinners, and all of that. Even the Lutherans had that. And you had to accept certain, this is how it's fixed, and this is how all the other doctrine works. And we were probably 12, 13 years old at the time. And it's like, okay, they're old enough to understand this. It's time to indoctrinate them, get it really into their heads. And it still is in my head. I still remember all that stuff. It's bad. But that's part of what we have to do is what a church has to do to keep going, is to make sure they get all that thinking right in your head to start with, and you keep reinforcing it. And you keep going to church every week because you have to keep reinforcing it. Why do you have to keep reinforcing it?
Because if you don't, you end up like us.
Well, maybe. But I think that should be a cell phone on their part.
Yeah, and I think that should give everyone pause to think about whether this is really true. I mean, if you tell me that, I don't know, general random fact. I'm trying to think of a general random fact that's not dead obvious, like the grass is green. Cell phones were invented in 1979. I don't know that that's true, but let's suppose
You're
that
close.
that's, yeah. Okay. When did you say?
You're close.
No, what do you have a year?
No, but it's
Oh, okay, close
you're
enough.
close to it. I don't know
Okay,
exactly.
so if somebody told me that, I would not need someone to tell me that over and over and over to keep believing it. It's either true or it's not true. And if I then find some data that says, no, it was actually in 1980, no big deal. I switched to believing that. But if this religion is really true, you shouldn't need to tell people over and over and over to try to keep them believing it.
Well, and that was kind of a point of one of the conversations I remember with one of my spiritual but non-religious friends. Is it's like, yeah, everybody has their own view. She'd say everybody can be right from her own viewpoint. But I'm like, well, how then do you correlate that with one another? How do you know what truth is if you don't have any means of comparing results, of testing and comparing, if it's only going to be based on your own internal thought processes? And that's what our scientific method does for us, is it gives us a way that we can cross-check each other in a way that's absolutely impossible with religious thought. And that's a much longer discussion we probably don't have time for here. And it's another one close to my heart. But
okay.
But that's just being able to compare in some kind of rational way our own views, and to be able to correlate those and to come to a common understanding. How do you do that if it's only based on what's inside here, which is inherently subjective, and no means of making it objective? And that was one of the key things I tried to share with her about that is, what am I going to do if you just telling me this is what it is?
Yeah.
What can I do with that? I don't know.
Okay. Ultimate reductionist question is this. Oops, I'm sorry. I didn't get the beginning of the question. Here we go. It's about pronouns. If I were non-binary, I would want my own singular sounding pronoun. I wouldn't want to be forced to choose the plural they to be used as singular. For example, I'm a green, and I cannot tell you how mad it makes me that I've gotten political polls where they literally ask me, which part, R or D, are you voting for, and give no other option. Okay. And ultimate reductionist, this is the reason why there are some other pronouns. And I do know that there's pushback from the conservatives that they don't like some of the, they don't like having so many choices on pronouns because it confuses them. But I do know at least one person who uses them as their pronouns, because that it doesn't have any plural connotation, and yet it also is a non-binary pronoun.
Part of the
Marla,
problem we have is just trying to work within the language structures that we have. And language is here to communicate. And so if we introduce new pronouns, then we have to wonder, is anybody going to understand what we're talking about, period? And how much explanation do we have to do to introduce that new vocabulary? This gets into some other work I've done in the past. But so I understand. It took me a while to get used to they, them with people. And I don't use those pronouns. But once I understood, it's like within the existing vocabulary we have, how can we connote something that is neutral gender other than it? And it is kind of offensive. And I thought about that when I was in Puerto Rico, where in Spanish language, they don't have anything in between. And so I wonder how that's handled in other gender, other things like that. Mobile phones, 1973. I knew 79 was close.
Well, Mage says in 1979 was the first cellular network.
Yeah,
so
you got on it. Okay.
Okay, I think that was a very good answer as well. This is why I think that we need to normalize people talking about their pronouns, wearing a name tag that has their pronouns on it, introducing themselves and saying, these are my pronouns. And I have attempted to do that, but I frequently forget. But yeah, I do think we need to normalize asking and telling people our pronouns.
And I see it much more among young people than I do among people of our generation. So yeah, I have great hope for our youth.
Yeah. And the Ultimate Reduction says, for example, I was born before Ms. was created, but Ms. felt natural and took off right away. Also, thank you for answering. Using plural as singular just sounds off to me. Great points. Yeah, I have trouble with that too for the same reason. Although my son pointed out to me that we actually do occasionally use they to refer to a single person. Like if someone knocks at the door and you say, who was at the door? What did they want? You know, I say it was the neighbor. Oh, what did they want? And you're referring to a single person. So we do use they to refer to a single person.
Or somebody cuts you off in traffic. And you say, they did that. You know.
Right.
You know, we do that all the time. So we do use they as a singular. It's not that hard to get used to.
Okay, we are out of time. But thank you very much for coming, Marla.
You're welcome.
And I have a couple of things to announce. I am ending my Tuesday night stream and I'm moving to Saturday afternoons. And I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is because I occasionally like to have people on from the UK, and this is an ungodly hour for people in the UK. A second reason is it just works better with some of the things that I like to do with my family. And so, you know, it just works out better. And a third reason is so I'm not bumping up against some of the other shows that are on in the evening on the weekdays. So my first Saturday afternoon stream will be this Saturday, March 4th. Aaron Raw will be my guest, and it will be at 3:30. I'm also cutting the streams to 60 minutes, from 90 minutes to 60 minutes. I know that when I see streams out there, I'm not real about watching a 90-minute conversation, but a 60-minute conversation tends to be more inviting, and so I'm going to be cutting back to the 60-minute time frame. And so that's what's coming up on Saturday. And then my next scripted video will be released a week from today. It will be next Tuesday. And that will be the new format from now on. Will be a live stream for 1 hour on Saturday afternoons and a scripted video released early Tuesday evening, either premiered or just simply released. Marla, did you have any closing thoughts you want to share?
Not really. I've enjoyed the conversation. It's been totally novel to me to do this, but yeah, thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I really thoroughly enjoyed your story, and it's always great to meet a fellow Godless Granny.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much to everyone in the chat. You contributed so much to the conversation as well. I've enjoyed your comments and your questions, and look forward to seeing everyone on Saturday. Live your life.